My name is Daryl Boness. I'm editor-in-chief of Marine Mammal Science, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our monthly Editors Select seminar series from the Society for Marine Mammalogy. The seminars presented at these sessions are based on papers published in Marine Mammal Science and are selected by the board of editors of the journal. So a couple of practical matters. You know from when you signed on that we will be recording. The recording will be available on the Society for Marine Mammalogy's website within a day or two. And for those who have questions, if you post your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat, we will be monitoring the Q&A and be passing those questions on to our speaker at the end of the presentation. So with that, let me introduce our speaker. Our speaker is Mr. Tim Awbery. Tim received a Bachelor's of Science in Conservation Biology and Ecology at Exeter University. He also received a Master of Science in Surveying Land and Environmental Management at Exeter University. Tim is currently working on his PhD at the Scottish Association for Marine Science. And his PhD work is focusing on acoustics and foraging of minke whales with an aim of contributing to their conservation. He's spent the last 3 years working in Montenegro, Albania, and Turkey. His presentation today, however, will be on common bottlenose dolphin, and it's based on a paper titled "The Effect of Commercial and Artisanal Fishing Practices on the Behavior Budget of Bottlenose Dolphin off the coast of Montenegro, South Adriatic Sea." So with that, I will turn it over to Tim to tell us about the impacts of different types of fishing vessels. Tim?
Thank you very much, Daryl. Hopefully you guys can see my presentation now. Just give me a shout if you can see it.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you particularly for anybody that's up early or up late to watch this, because I know we've got quite an international group of people watching. As Daryl said, my name's Tim Awbery, and I've come here this afternoon, this morning, this evening, wherever you are, to talk about the effect of commercial and artisanal fisheries on bottlenose dolphins in Montenegro. I thought I'd start the presentation by giving just a little bit of background about me. Given that the last time we were able to attend a face-to-face ECS or SMM event for me was back in Barcelona in 2018. So currently I'm backed in the Scottish Association for Marine Science, or SAMS. And just for people that aren't familiar with Europe, it's on the west coast of Scotland. And I study minke whales on the west coast of Scotland. And at the moment I'm working with density surface models to look at how minke whales move through Western Scottish waters. And then I'm producing models of threats and then overlaying them to produce potential risk maps. And you'll notice that I've asked you not to tweet these images. This isn't because I don't want the information to be shared particularly. It's because the minke models are still in their infancy. And on top of the threats are frankly a load of nonsense at the moment, because they're just simulated data as a bit of a proof of concept. So if anyone wants to talk to me about any of the minke whale modeling, then my details are on the screen, but this isn't why we're here today. Today we're here to talk about some of the work that I did before I came to Scotland. So prior to this, I worked in the Mediterranean. And for those of you that know the area, you'll know that was a bit of a brutal transition from the sunny Mediterranean to windy and wet Scotland. Whilst I was in the Mediterranean, I worked in Montenegro, which is pictured here in pink, Albania, which is in yellow, and Turkey, which is in black. And I'd like to take just a second to say that all of our thoughts with the organisation are with the people of Turkey and Syria at the moment, who've been victims of some horrific earthquakes. And I'd just like to ask if anyone is able to donate, then it's a really worthwhile thing to do. So before I came to soggy Scotland, I worked in the Mediterranean for 3 years. And during that time, with the help of an amazing group of researchers, volunteers, and funders, we're able to publish a lot of baseline information on species distribution, as well as the overlap with human threats. And for a lot of these places, it was some of the very first information that was available. So following this research, we knew that we had bottlenose dolphins in Montenegro, and we knew that they overlapped with fishing vessels. So what's the next logical step? Well, it's obviously to try and understand how dolphin behavior is affected by the presence of fishing vessels, because if the dolphins aren't affected, then does it really matter from a conservation management perspective? Now, this is certainly not a new area of study, and negative responses of marine mammals to vessels have been documented since the 80s. And obviously, these negative responses are bad for marine mammals, but I suppose the question we should be asking is really how bad they are, because it becomes very difficult to consider these negative reactions in management strategies if the biological implications aren't understood. And for that reason, one way to kind of approach this problem is to separate a dolphin's behavior into different categories, or we sometimes call them behavioral states, and then try and record these behavioral states at fixed time periods. And then the behavior can be analyzed using time discrete Markov chains. And we've got quite a diverse and distinguished audience here today, so I'm sure I'll be quickly corrected in the chat if I'm wrong, but I believe the first use of this in kind of a marine mammal behavioral context was some of the work done by David Lousseau, again on bottlenose dolphins in Doubtful Sound. And this quickly took off in kind of the world of marine mammalogy. And a quick Google Scholar search of dolphin behavior plus Markov chain, and we can see just how unoriginal scientists are. And I feel like I get away with saying this without being too cheeky, because if we scroll down that Google search a little bit further, then we also find my paper on tourism and how it affects dolphins. So we've got a lot of study on tourism, but not really looking at other vessels. And kind of this and fieldwork anecdotes from our work in Montenegro led us to wonder what effect exactly these fisher vessels might be having on bottlenose dolphins. And that really brings us to the subject of the talk tonight. And the more observant of you will notice that Laura is actually the lead author on this manuscript, but I'm afraid that she was unable to do this presentation today, so you're stuck with me instead. Before we go any further, I'd like to thank Laura, Romina, Molly, Juliana, Anna, Natasha, and Eileen for their hard work to get the study to where it is now. Pictured in the bottom of the study is also Doa. He's Eileen's son, and he also assisted or got in the way, depending on which way you're looking at it, in the field work. But either way, he deserves some credit too. Now, wait a minute, I hear you cry. You've introduced these discrete time Markov chains, but you've not explained what they are. So we'll just rewind back a little bit, and I'm going to explain exactly what Markov chains are with a little bit of an analogy. So suppose we have a person, and just to keep people entertained, let's give this character a bit of a backstory. So first, let's give our character a random name. So I'm pretty unimaginative, so I've called the character Tim. Now let's suppose our character Tim hypothetically enjoys indulging in a couple of drinks at the local pub. So for the purposes of the talk, let's say that whilst Tim's at the pub, he can only be doing two things. He could either be drinking Coke or he can be drinking beer. So let's say he's drinking Coke when we start our observations. Now, 15 minutes later, when we make our next recording of his behavioral state, he could still be drinking Coke, or he could have switched to beer. And after another 15 minutes, say he switched to beer, he could continue to drink beer, or he could switch to Coke. So you can see here that we now have all of the options of the two behavioral states and how we can transition between them on this very simple diagram. In nature, of course, animals rarely tend to persist in just two states, no matter how much we try and oversimplify them as humans. So let's try and make this a bit more obvious. And let's just add a third state in here as well. So let's add theoretical Tim doing some shots into this picture. Now, if we begin to add some numbers, So let's say that Tim's currently drinking Coke. We might observe that there's a 40% chance of him continuing to drink Coke, a 60% chance of him switching to drink beer. It is a pub after all, and a 0% chance that he will transition from drinking Coke to drinking shots. So now let's say that we're observing Tim drinking beer, then we might ascertain that he's 80% chance of him continuing to drink beer, a 10% chance of him transitioning to Coke, and a 10% chance of him transitioning to shots. And you'll notice that in each of these, they add up to 100% because we've said that Tim can only be in one of 3 states whilst he's at this pub. So finally, let's see that Tim is recording drinking shots. Now, we might calculate that if he's drinking shots, he's most likely to continue to drink shots, less likely to go on to drinking beer, and only really likely to go on to Coke if the bar staff had told him to sober up. Now, if we put all of these constituent parts together, then this is forming our Markov chain, because it's representing the probabilities of Tim transitioning between the different behavioral states. So let's give our character a little bit more of a backstory and say that he enjoys supporting Burton Albion Football Club or soccer club for our American friends. Now, Burton aren't the best of football clubs. And at the time of writing this, they're currently sat in 20th place in League One. Now, League One sounds pretty good, but in fact, there's actually 2 tiers of football above this. So Burton Albion are actually 20th place in the 3rd division of English football, having lost 3-2 on average in every single game this season. And as you can imagine, this is quite stressful for poor Tim. So if we now get back to our Markov chain, we know that the data we recorded on non-football days or control days is basically our data with no effect. And we might be interested in how this differs from the impact of football days. So on football days, our Markov chain might look a bit more like this, with an increased likelihood transition from Coke to beer and from Coke to shots, rather than staying drinking Coke. Similarly, we might have an increased likelihood of transitioning from beer to shots and an increased likelihood of remaining drinking shots. So if we bring all of this together again, then we can see that we have differences between our control chain on the left and our impact chain on the right. And this could be a little bit difficult to see comparing the numbers on the 2 different diagrams. So I'm just going to show you some important differences. So Tim was less likely to be drinking a relatively safe drink in the impact scenario, ignoring the potential diabetes and rotten teeth that comes from drinking Coke, and more likely to transition to a beverage with a higher alcohol content, potentially lowering his fitness. So hopefully that you can see over time, the presence of an anthropogenic stressor has caused Tim to end up having lower fitness. In this case, Burton Football Club could lead to Tim having reduced fitness because this is the anthropogenic stressor. And I appreciate that most of you internationally won't care about Burton Football Club. And to be honest, not that many people from the UK do either. So as an example, this works just as well if this was Tim was a Pistons fan in the US, or a Western Bulldogs fan in Aussie Rules, or even Perpignan in the top rugby in France. So let's now go and transition onto how dolphin behavior is affected by stressors. So the surveys that we conducted on either 6 meters or 12 meter motorboats or sailing boats, and the land surveys that we conducted using binoculars and field lights were from 6 predetermined survey sites that you can see on the map here. And the dark blue circles basically show the radius that we could see when we were looking from those theodolite sites. And we used a technique called instantaneous focal group scan sampling, and we were looking at the behavior of the dolphins every 5 minutes. And during this time, we used 4 behavioral states, which were diving, socializing units, surface feeding, and traveling. So these socializing units actually consisted of resting, milling, and socializing, which are all important cohesive behaviors. But unfortunately, we didn't have enough data to analyze them individually. So at each sampling interval, we also recorded the type and distance of the nearest vessel. And that looked a little something like this. So with each of our dolphin groups, we had our time sample, and then we had a behavior for each of these dolphin groups. On top of that, we had the boat type, and how close the boat was to the dolphin group. And you can see here that we've got three different categories of boats. So these are the commercial vessels, which are kind of the custom built industrial vessels, which are over 12 meters. We've got the artisanal fishing vessels, which are a little bit smaller, normally considerably smaller than 12 meters. And these generally weren't reliant on mechanical gear. And then right at the bottom, we've got all of the other non-fishing boats. And there is, of course, a fourth option, and that's when there's no boats at all. Now, if you go far enough in any direction, then you'll, of course, find a boat in the ocean. So we don't use an infinite amount. We use a radius of 400 meters to define absence. And this doesn't sound particularly far. And actually, this value was chosen based on a number of different studies who have also found effects at this distance. And details of those different studies can be found in the paper. So the next step was to remove all of the instances where our closest vessel was within 400 meters but wasn't a fishing boat. And this left us with three categories of data: control data at the bottom, where there are no boats within 400 meters, and two impact scenarios. So where we had commercial vessels within 400 meters, or where we had an artisanal fishery, which was in 400 meters of our dolphin group. And there are a couple of extra data rules that we use to maximize the data we could actually use and minimize bias from other factors. But I won't bore you by going into each of these. If you are interested, they can also be found in the paper. And you kind of end up being left with a data set like this. And this allows us to look at how many times a dolphin transitions from one behavior to another. And we can see here that if a group is diving, then they're most likely to continue diving, whereas the least likely to transition from diving to resting and socializing, which are those social units which I talked about earlier. And we can begin to look at the probability of dolphins transitioning from one state to another. And we do that using this terrifying equation. Now, like all terrifying equations, it's not quite as scary as it seems. If we look at Pij, this is the probability of going from the preceding state I to the succeeding state J. Aij is the number of times that a dolphin goes from state I to state J. And the bottom is just the total number of observations where I is the preceding state. So to give that a bit of an example, if we're interested in looking at the number of times that, the probability of a dolphin going from diving to traveling, then we look at the number of times that the dolphin goes from diving to traveling, and then we divide it by the total number of observation where diving is the preceding state. So we look at all the times where diving goes to socializing, diving goes to surface feeding, diving goes to traveling, and where diving goes back to itself. And then the final part of this equation just reiterates what we said before, which is the probability of going from diving to all the other states must equal to 1, because it encompasses all of our behaviors. And this gives us our Markov chain. So here I've shown the control chain. So that's the absence of boats, representing the probabilities of observed bottlenose dolphin behavioral state transitions. And once we had this for our control and our two impact chains, then we use Monte Carlo simulations to estimate the behavioral budgets of the bottlenose dolphins. So how did the Monte Carlo simulations work? Well, effectively, we created a time series of behavioral states in R. We randomly chose diving to start with as the initial state. And then the second behavioral state in the time series is randomly chosen based on the probability of moving from diving to another behavioral state. So imagining that our second behavioral state was socializing, then again, based on the probabilities of transitioning from socializing, then we can make another decision and the process repeats itself like that. So we did this enough times to create 1,000 different time series. And then for each of those, we removed the first 100 states in order to decrease the bias that was associated with us choosing diving to start with. And then we limited these time series to 288 5-minute time steps, which is equivalent to a 24-hour period, in order to try and represent the diurnal behavior of the dolphin. So onto some results. It takes an awful long time to try and collect enough data to do this kind of analysis, particularly when you're not constantly seeing dolphins. So we surveyed for 2,100 hours in total, and that was over 4 years between September 2016 and August 2020. And during this time, we saw dolphins roughly in 1 in 3 surveys, and this resulted in nearly 150 hours of observed dolphin behavior. And if you look at this little bar chart on the right-hand side, you can see that traveling and diving really dominate the behavior of dolphins in Montenegro. And we've got over 40% of the behaviors were traveling and over 30% were diving. And there's kind of been some suggestions that Montenegro might act as a bit of a migration corridor. I'll stress that they are just suggestions at the moment, but that Montenegro might act as a migration corridor between Croatia and Albania, and even further afield. We can also see that there are actually boats within 400 meters of the dolphins more than 50% of the time, but that most of these boats weren't fishing boats, and so they had to be removed from the analysis. So onto the Markov chains themselves. I'm going to show the artisanal example first. So we've got the control chain on the left-hand side here, and then we've got the artisanal chain on the right-hand side. And I've just shown the significant differences here to try and make it a bit easier to comprehend. So if we look at the transition here, then on the left, we've got a 12% chance transitioning from socializing units to diving. And the 12% on the right-hand side is the difference. So it actually means that in the impact chain, we've got a 24% chance. So we've actually doubled our chance of going from socializing units to diving. Hopefully that makes sense. And I suppose for me, one of the most important changes that we see in the artisanal impact chain is that we see a slight decrease in animals continuing to surface feed, and we see quite a large increase in animals going from surface feeding to traveling. So if we move on to the commercial fishing results, we see that there's not only more effects that were significant, which are represented by having kind of more numbers on the right-hand side, but also the magnitude of these effects is much larger, which is indicative of the commercial vessels having more effect. And again, there's a lot going on here, but I want to just draw your attention to a key change. And hopefully you can see in this green box that we've got in the control situation, we've again got a 12% probability of going from socializing units to diving. Whereas in the impact chain, when we look at the commercial vessels, we've actually got a 50% chance of going from socializing to diving. So we've got a 38% increase, sorry. And when we run these probabilities through the Monte Carlo analysis, we begin to see what the effect of these changes is on the behavioral budgets of these dolphins. So again, we'll start with the artisanal fisheries. And here, the solid red line, you can see at 0, represents how much time will be spent in each of the behavioral states in a control situation. And the dashed red line is the average of the 1,000 Monte Carlo simulations in the impact chain. So interestingly, we can see that there's very little difference between diving and traveling, between the control and impact scenarios for artisanal fishing. There is a slight increase in the time spent socializing, just here. And there's actually a significant decrease in the amount of time spent surface feeding, which of course is really important behavior. If we move to the commercial fisheries, then unsurprisingly, we can see, given the Markov chains, we can see that there's more of a difference, and there are actually significant increases in diving and surface feeding. So diving and surface feeding, and then there was a significant decrease in traveling. So onto a brief discussion of the results. Firstly, commercial fishing vessels appear to be having more of an impact on dolphins than artisanal fishing vessels, but the decrease in surface feeding that we're seeing in the presence of artisanal fishing vessels really shouldn't be overlooked. One really interesting result when we look at the commercial impact is that we see this diving increase and we see this surface feeding increase. So what potential reasons could there be for this increase? Well, the diving behavior that we see is also potentially is also a potential proxy of feeding. I mean, it could also indicate an avoidance behavior or something like that, but there's a potential that this is also feeding behavior. And we think what we're seeing here is the development of dolphins taking advantage of the trawlers through opportunistic feeding, which has been documented in a couple of other studies already. And this would also explain the decrease in traveling, as the dolphins would spend less time traveling between these feeding events if they can reliably predict where these feeding events are going to occur. And of course, seeing a fishing vessel is a pretty reliable predictor that fishing is going to be happening. If this is the case, then it's possible that they might be willing to tolerate the disturbance if the cost benefit is in the dolphin's behavior. And as well as something kind of large and scary approaching you in the water, there's also kind of the cacophony of noise that you get. If anyone's ever done acoustic studies and listened as a large vessel like a fishing vessel comes by, then you get this really horrendous kind of noise across the hydrophone. And this is the audio slide which Daryl was talking about, which unfortunately I can't play, but I did have some acoustics. This isn't from Montenegro, this is actually courtesy of Patrick Lyon from Ireland. But hopefully you'll be able to see just as well from the spectrogram what it was that I was trying to show. If we look at this lower spectrogram, kind of the yellow and red one, then we can see we get an awful lot of noise caused by the vessel in the frequency band, which is between 0 hertz and 1 kilohertz. And if we look at this on a bit of a larger scale and we look at the higher frequencies at the top, then what we can see is that at around 24 kilohertz, we're getting this pinging. And that is a really irritating noise if you're listening to it on a hydrophone. And what it actually is the echo sounder of the boat. So it emits this quite high frequency for us anyway, quite high frequency, at around 24 kilohertz. And this varies with boats between about 20 and 50 kilohertz, depending on the type of echo sounder. And if we look at the audiogram of the dolphins, and it's possibly a little bit small on your screens, but if we look at about where 24 kilohertz is, this is very much within the frequency range of the dolphins, so that they're probably quite irritated by this noise as well. Of course, this kind of association with fishing vessels comes at a cost, more than it just being frankly irritating. It may interfere with dolphins' natural ability to obtain prey. It might actually cause some displacement if dolphins are moving away from their natural habitats towards areas where they're more likely to experience fishing vessels. And of course, it increases the likelihood that dolphins are either going to collide with vessels or they're going to get entangled in fishing gear. And I've heard rumors, although not heard it myself, that in Croatia, which is just north of Montenegro, we're actually getting dolphins that jump in and out of trawl nets. And I'd be really interested if anyone here knows whether that's got any truth to it. And then finally, trawling has actually been shown in a number of different studies to affect fine-scale distribution of animals and even cause dolphins to leave protected areas. So there are some quite severe impacts beyond just disturbance. So at the moment in Montenegro, there's a relatively low level of fisheries, and as far as we're aware, there's quite a low level of bycatch. The few strandings that do wash up on Montenegrin shores don't appear to show signs of entanglement. But if the fleet was to increase, like is the kind of the general trend across the Mediterranean, then we may see these effects increasing. And of course, in this study, we're only really able to look at the short-term effects of the disturbance by the two different types of marine vessel. And in long term, we might not actually see kind of some of these population chains for a couple of decades. And then one point that I really can't emphasize enough, this is just the beginning of kind of our understanding of how this dolphin behavior works. And there's layers and layers upon this research to try and peel back For example, if we split the data up by season, then we get another layer of complication. So this is a control scenario for just spring and summer that I've highlighted here. And we can see that we've got the 4 different behaviors again. So we've got diving, socializing units, surface feeding, and traveling across the top. And in this instance, the shorter dashed blue line is the mean time spent in that behavior for the year. And then we've got the spring and summer variants on top of that. And you can see, just looking at diving, then on the right, at the top panel, sorry, for spring, we're getting a much higher than the yearly average. And then if we look at summer, we're getting much lower than the yearly average. So that's not even to begin to mention the effects of other things that we might see, like the presence of calves and things like that. So we really don't have a great understanding of exactly how complex these behaviors are. And I think we'll find more and more as these studies kind of happen over the next few years. So just a couple of final thoughts. Artisanal fishing may well be more sustainable, but we really can't avoid that surface feeding decrease that we saw, which was caused by the vessels being there. And if at all possible, we should be minimizing how often the dolphins and the artisanal fisheries are interacting. Another really kind of poignant thing that we need to consider is whether the surface feeding decline is caused just by the artisanal fishing vessels, or whether it's just vessels in general, and the commercial vessels are actually the exception. Because there's another study that I said I was involved in by Jack Clarkson and our other co-authors, and in that we also found that the tourism vessels decreased the surface feeding that was being done by bottlenose dolphins. So there's a lot more to look into there, and we don't know how other types of boats are influencing dolphins as well. I'd hazard some of the bigger boats are probably causing more of a disturbance, but then you get unexpected kind of side effects where you get dolphins kind of interacting with these big vessels, and bow riding and things like that. So this really is just the beginning, and I think it's an immensely interesting bit of research, and we're probably, if I'm completely honest, we're probably simplifying it at the moment. It'll be really interesting to see what people find over the next few years. So I'd like to just finish by thanking my co-authors again, and thanking the RIF Foundation, who provided the funding for some of this work. And then I'll finish by saying thank you very much for having me here to talk today. Thank you to Daryl and Aisha, and thank you very much for listening. I'll happily field questions. I don't know exactly how useful I'll be for the very specifics of the analysis, because it's been quite a long time since we actually submitted this study now. But if you've got any specific questions, then feel free to email me, and I'll dig back into the data and get back to you. So yeah, thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Tim. I must admit, I don't know Markov chain analyses, but I enjoyed your description. That brought it down to a level that I could understand. I don't know if I see any questions come up yet, but one that came to mind that I have is you excluded samples essentially that had other types of vessels, and I wonder why you
Can people still hear me? Is it Daryl that's gone, or is it me that's lost connection?
Yes, I think Daryl is frozen. Okay. We see you, Daryl.
Yeah, I just had I got kicked off briefly. So did you hear my question, Tim, or did you answer? No.
No, I'm afraid I only heard the start of your question.
Okay, so my question had to do with the removal of the category of other vessels, and And I wondered why maybe you wouldn't have kept that in as another type of control against fishing vessels, so that you might be able to say something about whether it's vessels more broadly or fishing vessels. Have a comment on that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and as I said, we kind of compared it to the previous results that we'd got on tourism vessels. That was done with very slightly different methodology. But basically, the reasoning is that this is quite a new study in Montenegro, and as I kind of alluded to, it takes a really long time to get enough behavioural data in each of these states, and effectively for many of the other categories, we just didn't have enough data to be able to be confident about kind of the outcomes, which is why we stuck with the fishing vessels. But it's something, as you said, I'm now in Scotland, but it's something that I know the research group are really keen to look into in the future.
We have a question on Facebook.
Okay.
If I may jump in. It's from Natalie Morales Rincon. She's saying, excellent research. In terms of the social structure, did you see changes that can also influence the behavior with the two types of fishing?
So I'm not entirely sure what you mean in terms of the social structure, where you kind of talking about whether we saw changes in the group dynamics or changes in kind of the group size and whether there's calves and things. But again, unfortunately, like I said, it's very much a kind of baseline study. It's something that I got asked when this work was presented at the ECS as well, about calves. And no, it's not something we looked into. It's something we'd really like to look into in the future. And yeah, unfortunately, it's just one of the problems with not having enough data. Is that you can't really begin to break things down any further without losing confidence in the results you're presenting.
Okay, thank you. We have one more question that's coming from Zoom. Eric Simon's asking, you talk about behavior being affected, but you don't say anything about what behavior changes may be affordable. Do you have anything to say about whether certain changes in behavior may be affordable?
Difficult set of questions. Thanks, Eric. That's another good question. Yeah, I suppose at this point we just don't know enough about how these. We still don't know enough about how these disturbances really kind of extrapolate into kind of more long-term changes. And as you say, that there is presumably a level where these changes to behavior can be affordable. If we only had kind of one fishing vessel kind of past a month and that was disturbing dolphins, then that would no doubt be affordable. But we're not quite sure where that level is at the moment, I don't think. And again, that's going to be different for different behaviors. So surface feeding and the diving is kind of a proxy for feeding. They're obviously quite important behaviors on a very short term, but then the behaviors that are involved with the socializing are perhaps important on a bit more of a mid to long term, particularly when we're talking about kind of reproductive behaviors and stuff like that. So sorry to spurt the same answer as the other questions. I'm afraid this is something that we just don't know, and it'd be really interesting to look into in the future, and hopefully we won't have to find out the hard way.
Thank you.
So I have another question and maybe if I went back and reread the paper, maybe it'd be obvious and I wouldn't ask it. But so diving versus foraging. I mean, diving as a category is probably fairly complex and includes foraging and other things going on underwater. So I guess my question there is, how do you interpret what changes in diving might mean?
Tim, you're muted.
Oh, apologies. The problem with the diving behavior is that we just don't know, and we're interpreting it because of the surface feeding. We're interpreting that it could be to do with foraging, and generally because the animals are staying in a similar area, then I'm more inclined to believe it's to do with foraging than perhaps an evasive maneuver caused by the boats. Of course, we can't rule that out, and I think one thing that would be really interesting in future studies is to try and get some acoustics involved. Can you hear me, Aicha? Yeah, so one thing, would be really interesting to get some acoustics involved, because then if we've kind of got the echolocation clicks, then we can have a much better idea that they're foraging, especially when we get kind of to the faster echolocation clicks. Whereas if we're only hearing whistles, then we have a better idea that they're probably not feeding. They're probably forming some sort of cohesive evasive behavior.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, again, I lost sound for a minute, so I only got part of your response there, but hopefully everybody else heard the whole response.
Yeah, we did.
Great.
I have a question, actually. So, well, this is probably going to be slightly less scientific, but I'm sure a lot of people are wondering about this. So, as marine mammal researchers, most of us really love field work above everything else. And from what I understood, you were present in doing field work in Montenegro yourself a couple of seasons. So what was your favorite part in this? Or do you have like a favorite moment that you'd like to share with us?
Narrowing down one favorite moment is difficult. I mean, I love being on the water. I grew up right in the center of England, so I was as far away from the sea as you could possibly be. So just any of the boat work really, it's always really enjoyable for me. I can be on a boat for 12 hours without eating or getting tired, just because I'm sure many people here are the same. It's fantastic. It's just the best thing. So any of the boat work, it has to be up there with my highlights.
And one more question for the students who are watching your this webinar. What would be your advice to future marine mammal scientists who are at undergrad, masters, or even high school level? Do you have any tips for them to get to the point where you are, for example?
I took a bit of an unconventional route to marine science, because I actually did a small stint engineering and mapping before I returned from my kind of undergraduate in conservation biology. So I'm not sure I'm the best person to speak about this, but I suppose from my experience, the best thing is to try and find a niche that you're really interested in and that isn't particularly well explored. So for me now, it's a lot of the kind of the spatial data work, because I've got that engineering background and kind of the mapping and coordinate reference system background. That stuff comes quite naturally to me, whereas a lot of people struggle with it. So I suppose my advice is to try and find a niche that isn't really being looked at for a particular animal or for a particular area. And I kind of had my little tongue-in-cheek joke about us all copying each other's research ideas, including myself with the tourism stuff. But if you've seen a study in one area, then why not repeat it? Especially if you're kind of at an undergraduate or master's level, then why not repeat it in your area, to see if it is kind of a more general thing, or whether it's a more place by place thing. And I'm afraid the automatic lights have just gone off for me, so you'll have to deal with me in darkness for the last couple of minutes of this.
Thank you for your answer, Tim. And also, unconventional routes, I think they're the best, because not everything is in a straight line, and it's good for people to see that you don't really have to go on a conventional route to be able to do a PhD on marine mammals. So
yeah, definitely. And actually, I'd argue that a lot of the people I work with haven't taken a kind of straight line, people imagine is a conventional route to a PhD at all. So don't worry about that if you've taken a side step or two.
Yeah, interestingly, Tim, we've had a similar, I think, response to the notion of finding a sort of unique niche to put yourself in. Although I actually sort of wonder how easy that is today. I mean, I think back to sort of 50 years ago when I was a graduate student. I think it was a whole lot easier to find a unique area to focus on that had little attention. Now the field is much more expanded and a lot more people out there doing so. I think it is getting harder and harder to do. But also, as you say, replicating is important in science. So, you know, obviously when you're doing a PhD, you need to have some original work, but replication is also critical. Well, I don't know, Aisha, do we have more questions from Facebook? I don't see
Not
any.
as far as I can see now.
Okay. Well, I guess maybe it is 11:52 for me here. We're close to the hour. I don't know. I don't have any further questions. Anything else you want to say, Tim? If not, I guess we'll come to an end.
No, yeah, just very quickly, I'll add a comment that I think there's still plenty of, you've said that the field's expanded and become somewhat full, but I think there's still plenty of avenues to explore. We don't know where minke whales go when they leave the UK, and they're 7-meter animals. So there's still plenty of holes that need filling, and I think there's still plenty of niches for people to find still. But yes, it's probably a bit harder. And other than that, just thank you very much for having me to speak today.
Well, thank you for agreeing to give a seminar on, based on your paper in Marine Mammal Science. Thank you for publishing in Marine Mammal Science, and maybe we'll see further papers from you in the time to come. So with that, I think we'll sign off. Thank everyone for attending, and hopefully you'll tune in next month. Every third Thursday of the month, we will have a seminar unless we don't manage to get one scheduled. So we will see you next month. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.